I mean, as you said, I'm the last speaker, so I hope it's not last but not least. And especially I've been following such a distinguished line of speakers like Mary and Paul and Graham. And what I'm going to say is very much in line with the messages that we've just been hearing now. Putting people, it's all about people rather than property. I like to think about it as your own sort of home rather than just a building. And also empowering people, as you say, to take control of their own lives. And it was quite interesting. I think someone this morning was talking about this feeling of pushing the blame upwards. So is it our job? Is it the local authority's job? Is it the Environment Agency? Is it government? And at the end of the day, when you've had a flood or something else has happened to your home, at the end of the day, as Mary said, it's really down to you. But I'm going to talk about a research project and sort of really a larger project that I've been working on since 2012, actually. Takes a lot of my life. It's called Communities Living Sustainably. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but it was launched in 2013 and by the Big Lottery, and it's funded by the Big Lottery. And they gave £12 million, which is a tremendous amount of money, to 12 community groups around the country. That was £1 million each. They had to bid for this. We got involved when there was a short list of 30 groups, and we worked with some of these groups to help them develop their plans and their applications to be chosen as one of the 12, and the 12 were chosen in 2013. The idea of this was the plans were actually for each community to develop something for themselves, basically for suitable for their community, driven by the community, and they were very much partnerships. So the groups could have been, they included local authorities, local education charities, local development trusts, anything and everything, housing associations, and they came together to actually look at their community and look at what they could do to build resilience to the environmental, economic and social impacts of a changing climate, to help vulnerable people to adapt to climate change, to encourage behaviour change amongst individuals and communities. The whole project was coordinated by Groundwork UK, and they put together a learning partnership that included them and 5 others. That was the Energy Saving Trust, ourselves, City Farms and Community Gardens, NEF, the New Economic Foundation, and obviously Groundworks and Big themselves. So the process was quite a sort of complicated one in some ways, but quite simple in others. So the aim of the partnership was to provide support for the groups. Each group had an enabler from one of the partners that we worked with the group throughout. I was working with a group called Liverpool 8, Living Sustainably, which is based in Toxteth, and each one of us had a different group to help. They also were very, very focused on learning and peer-to-peer learning and sharing the learning. Throughout we've had dissemination, which is now, as the projects are coming to an end, is really sort of ramping up. So looking at the communities, providing tools and guides and resources for them, and also aiming to actually engage with funders and stakeholders to help with taking these forward future support. Because one of the big problems, these projects, they could either go for a 3-year or a 5-year program, and it's quite amazing how quickly that time has gone. And especially with new groups that were doing things that were quite new to them, they went down a lot of blind alleys and came back again. And feeling after 3 years now, it's just about they're getting confident, they're actually being able to make a difference. And right, where do we go from here once the 3 years, 5 years of funding has gone? From our point of view, the 5 partners, and the 4 partners here, were actually leading on different learning strands. So there was energy, growing and food, behaviour change, and resilience was the one that BRE, given our background, was actually leading on. So what we did was initial research when the project had not very long been going, so it's about a year. And we carried out some interviews with each of the groups to find out what they were actually doing in terms of climate change resilience. And this highlighted a gap in activities in the area of adaptation amongst the CLS groups. There were some very good examples of good practice, mainly focusing on flooding, and that was obviously in areas that had had experience of flooding themselves. But the other half of the groups weren't really doing anything, and they didn't really understand what climate change resilience was about, what adaptation was about. It wasn't something that was on their radar. And what we found was a need for greater integration between community-led and statutory-led activities. And there was a very big gap. I mean, it made me really think about my area. It's not something that I've ever thought about. We're not particularly a high-risk area for flooding. I don't know who my resilience sort of forum is. I don't know anything about it. And I think most people in the country think that unless something happens. And also there was a need for accessible information and resources, including examples of practical activities for communities, such as we've been hearing about today. So this initial baseline was followed up by a wider research programme, and that took place last year and finished a few months ago. And the objectives were to explore the challenges faced by the community groups in building climate resilience, to identify support and resources for them, and share lessons based on the activities of the other groups. And there were 4 main work streams. So we started off with stakeholder interviews and questionnaires to the 12 CLS groups. We then carried out some test bed workshops, and these were for 2 groups that, again, you could call them naive groups. They hadn't actually thought about it before, wasn't something that was on their radar, but they were obviously interested in finding out a bit more and to test some of the tools with them. We ran a workshop for stakeholders in February 2016 to get their feedback, and that included people like the Environment Agency. Joseph Rowntree had brought out their Climate Just tool, DEFRA, other people from statutory and community bodies, and the 12 groups as well. And then we developed an information directory of guidance, case studies, resources and tools for community groups to use, and also a summary key findings report of what our findings were from the whole research and lessons learned. So this was a survey that we carried out to find out actually what's happening in the groups. A lot of the groups were working on engagement activities, on things like food, growing, farming, energy, which for them was much more visible. So for them they had to start off sort of a bit of a journey to understand what climate change resilience, what adaptation was all about. The questionnaire covered questions about themselves, the community, about climate change adaptation activities in their community, their awareness and use of information, how they gain community buy-in, vulnerable groups in their areas, and also we asked people to volunteer to be a test bed. So just some of the key findings. So, unsurprisingly, the group's main concerns relating to climate change were about flooding, about food security, fuel poverty, and extreme cold, because a lot of the groups that they were actually involved with were people that were in very much sort of lower economic groups, people who were incomers to the community, people who often just fell off the radar. And they also were asked about their knowledge about climate change adaptation, and in spite of, when you talked in detail to people, finding out that they didn't really know very much, they still rated themselves as fair, good, or very good, and nobody as poor or very poor. It's one of the problems with questionnaires. People don't always tell the truth, I think. We then asked them about community interest and barriers to community buy-in. And as you can see here, most people did not have a great deal of community interest in their area. There was a fair amount, some degree, very little. No one said there was none at all, but it wasn't something that was, again, on the radar, depending which group it was. And the main barriers were the challenge of maintaining interest, belief that it's not an issue locally, lack of resources. So really sort of the same usual suspects. And one of the respondents said that for them, the greatest barrier to getting community buy-in on climate change is this challenge of developing a long-term response and maintaining interest. So you can talk to people, you can run an event, and they can get interested, excited about it, but then after a few days, that will dissipate. What was interesting about what people said about vulnerable groups in the local areas, that there was quite a wide range, and they very much depended on what the local area was. A group which I hadn't actually thought of myself, which probably is my fault, is that people whose livelihoods are at risk. So we heard this morning about small businesses, but a lot of these groups are on coastal areas, so fishermen and farmers, who obviously, you know, if you've got flooding, it's going to really impact on them. People who are on low incomes, fuel poor, low skilled people. And as well as sort of looking at climate change and creating flooding from flooding coming into the property, something that we also sort of discussed was things like if you're not actually heating your home properly, you then get frozen pipes possibly in the wintertime, and then you will get a burst pipe which actually is flooding your property from the inside, which will then give you very, very similar issues. But it's a single property issue. You haven't necessarily got a community who are going through the same thing, and that can also have an impact psychologically on people. Obviously people in poor health, people in poor housing, and groups that face social inclusion. A lot of these groups were in areas where a lot of refugees and incomers and transient populations were coming, people that had English as a second language and felt very isolated. And this was the Irwell Valley, one of the groups, and their definition of what they thought vulnerable groups were, that reasons of age, disability, health, severe financial insecurity, they're unable to safeguard their own personal welfare or the personal welfare of members of their household, which I thought was quite good. So one of the things, as I said, from the first research was that there seemed to be a lack of accessible information. There's loads and loads of information out there. But if you're somebody that isn't particularly highly skilled, highly educated, you're not used to looking at these things. And even for people, we tend to feel that everybody today has access to computers, the internet, and is computer savvy. And we found from talking to a lot of our groups that's not true. Not only have we got these problems with people with knowledge, with education, with skills, with lack of English, but we've still got a lot of areas in the country where they can't necessarily access Wi-Fi. And so paper-based resources for some of these, including one of our groups in Sunderland we were talking to, they felt that some of their areas had that problem as well. So maybe something that maybe is paper-based is often easier for people to access. So the information directory is for third sector and community organisations, and it's to help them overcome barriers of resilience. So it's got to be local, understandable information on climate change, resources for engagement and implementation support, and knowledge of how do they find the most effective measures for them. As I mentioned, there is a bit of information overload, and it's very much written for non-experts, simple non-technical language. It signposts existing website because there are quite a number of those, which are good, and we've colour-coded it for easy navigation. There are some copies around, but it is actually hosted on the Centre for Resilience website, and I'll give you the link at the end of this. Okay, so this is just an example of one of the pages. So just looking at the colour coding, I'll just quickly go through that, which is... Right. So we've got different colours. We've got green, blue, yellow, purple, and a sort of magenta colour, but you can't see them all there. And we've actually divided it into different sections, which is green is looking at multiple climate risks, so overarching. We've got blue looking at excess fuel poverty, excess coal fuel poverty, orange, which is excess heat. We've got flooding, biodiversity, agriculture, forestry and food insecurity, and then we've got another one on indirect impacts and business losses. So if you were just looking particularly at flooding, you could just look through very, very quickly and see which ones are relevant to you. The other thing which we've put in the information directory, which people were all asking for, and we've heard of some of these case studies today, were case studies from the CLS project and ones that they could share their experience with other groups. So flooding and extreme weather were the two most common climate change risks faced, and these exemplar communities were responding to the challenges by adopting adaptation measures. And a lot of them were trying to, again, prevent avoidable impacts through preparation. I'll talk a little bit more quickly about that in a minute. But the CLS funding enabled them to engage with their community, and it was linked to challenges accessing vulnerable groups and fuel poverty and poor housing. So these groups tended to be in places of multiple deprivation. So we chose 5 projects. They were Sustainably in Cumbria, Sustainable Sheppey in Kent, Communities Living Sustainably in Dorset, which was based around Bridport, One Planet Middlesbrough, and the Irwell Valley Sustainable Community in Salford. And as I said, this work was going on towards the end of 2015 and into 2016. And of course, in December 2015, I think 3 of these, well, obviously Sustainably Eden, which was around Cumbria, Penrith, and Salford, and I think Dorset, yeah, that time wasn't so bad, but they were obviously went through their own experience of flooding and what they could do actually with their community to develop, to address this. So these are just general measures and activities, but I thought if I've got just a very few minutes, I'm just going to really run through, just pick out a few that each group had done. So the one in Dorset, based around Dorchester and Bridport, and they'd really focused on conducting scenario planning workshops and producing action plans. And they tried to work with the community on looking at other things besides flooding, but they reported that they found it's very difficult, that people weren't so interested or focused on things like overheating. Flooding was something they focused on, but they did quite understand when they actually discussed it in the scenario planning, the impact of possible overheating, particularly on elderly people. It was an area that were quite a lot of hills, and so they were talking about what happens if we do get heat waves. We've got older people having to walk back from the shops up the hill. Maybe we could put benches along so that people could rest. So some really, really practical ideas, which then some of them were implemented. So that's still continuing, Dorset. The one that was the Irwell Valley Communities Project. In fact, in December, the Irwell burst its banks in Salford. And what they had done, they'd already identified the core, it was 140 of the most vulnerable people. And even though it was too late to do anything actually before the flood, once the flood took place, they were able to give these list of addresses and contacts to the emergency services, who were able to actually prioritise them for rescue. So they were doing a lot of these kind of stakeholder engagement plans, things that they were actually working on anyway as part of their communities, but taking a little bit further. So a few of them developed area-specific action plans. They were raising awareness of workshops, schools and media. A lot of them working with local radio, and they found that was really helpful, getting people interested. They were establishing these to support the vulnerable groups. The group up in Cumbria had actually worked with a local carers group through the community service volunteers, and they actually were training the carers because they would be the first line of people to actually get out the people who they were actually had caring responsibilities for. And nobody had actually thought of working with a group like that before. And also they were collaborating across the country with other community groups who had similar issues. Okay, as I say, we then took 2 groups, which was Manor House in London and Sustainable Sunderland, who hadn't actually done very much on climate change or resilience. And we ran a half-day workshop session with them. We shared information about adaptation, and we tried some of the tools, particularly Joseph Rowntree Foundation Climate Just tool, which they all found really useful. Have you all come across this tool? No? All right, well, if you take away the information directory, it allows you to map your local area and to overlay different overlays, so you can look at the flood risk, you can look at different vulnerabilities, you can look at overheating risk, and so you can actually build up a picture of what the issues are in a local neighbourhood.
What's it called again? Sorry.
It's called Climate Just.
Just.
And it's on the Joseph Rowntree Foundation website, and they have their own website as well. It came out, it's probably been launched about 6 months ago. Yeah, does anybody know when was it launched? 6 months?
2 years ago.
Is it as long as that?
Yeah, really useful for a conversation.
Yeah, there were some issues with if you want to really go down to a very detailed level. But you, yeah. But it also, the website has a lot of useful resources, just general resources for people as well. And people, yeah, running the workshop, it was really good because, as Paul said, it's really a catalyst for talking about the issues in an area where people hadn't thought about it. And the workshops included people from the local community, from schools, local authorities, everybody that wanted to come. So they were really interesting. And we also obtained feedback on the draft directory. We also produced a key findings report, which is more top level, and that is just reporting on what we've done on the research and actually giving some key learning points, really looking more at perhaps government and policymakers for what they could do and what we felt that was needed to move forward. As I said, funding for these groups was quite an issue because when it comes to an end, a lot of their work is then looking for further funding. And it's quite hard to get small amounts of funding for a specific issue. For instance, like the benches in the local area around Dorset. And so we also ran a Stakeholder Workshop, which is showing a picture of us there. And we gained feedback from partners, and that's all in the key findings report. Something else that BRE did, which I'll just mention, was one of the factors that BIG is really interested in for the project is obviously monitoring and evaluation, because they're giving the groups a substantial amount of money and they want to know whether it's been good value for money and what has it made a difference to the community. So at the very beginning we developed something called the community assessment tool, and that's looking at 8 areas of sustainability, of resilience. And it's actually carried out in a workshop setting. So this was done right at the beginning, and we got the whole groups together, sometimes about 20 people in a room. And we worked through this together, and it's a rating system, a self-assessment rating system. And for each impact, so this one is flood resilience and adaptation, I've just taken one page, you rate yourself as a community of whether you're unknown risk, whether you're up to sort of determining a risk, refining it. So do you actually have local maps? Do you have, are they enough hand of definition to identify your flooding risks? Next level up is minimising these impacts. So if you've got a high risk of flooding, have you got contingency plans in place? And then the next level will be actually working to reduce the risks. So how are you going to reduce the incidence of, well, it's not the incidence of flooding, it's what happens after the flooding, coping with the flooding, and also the flooding itself. So is the local area providing suds, etc. And again, it sort of was just a way of getting people to think about things and talk about things. And the other 8 areas we talked about, so climate change, there was community, ecology and biodiversity, governance, local economy, resources, transport and mobility, and well-being. And we did this at 3 times during the project. And there we are on April 12, April 14, and in May 16. And gratifyingly enough, for most of these 8 themes, each community sort of assessed themselves as having improved. The ones that were probably least changed was the transport and mobility one. There was a lot of feeling in the communities that wasn't something that they had very much control over. But you can see that things like community, local economy, climate change and resilience, people thought they'd improved quite highly over the course of the project. So even though it's self-assessment, it was something that was a guide to how people felt about the community. And in fact, the whole idea of the whole project is that it should make you have more ownership, more control about your area. What was nice for that, well, I used to go up to Liverpool every quarter to sort of meet the group and talk to them. And in about the 3rd year, I was in the taxi, and the taxi driver started telling me about the area and how it had improved and how people were so much happier living there, much prouder living there. There's so much more vibrancy and dynamism in the area. And I think that is sort of, anecdotal, but I think that's probably a lot of what most of the groups felt, that they had made this kind of a difference. So just in terms of the lessons learned from our resilience theme research, as just to reiterate really what people have been saying before, that community groups are well placed to drive these adaptation activities, and particularly when they focus on vulnerable groups. So working with people that actually know the area is much easier than somebody coming from the top and trying to find out where these people are. Communities can be really creative and innovative messengers, because if you read the case studies, it was fantastic, some of the things that they actually did. Local knowledge can adapt approaches in ways that are effective, but it's more difficult for national organisations to do this, but very much having a partnership approach that the local and the national should be working together. There are lots of opportunities for communities to deliver low-tech, low-cost interventions, but the statutory body should be more creative in engaging with these community groups, and we know that that's something that's not easy. What the groups found as well, that rather than starting from scratch and just saying, okay, we're going to have a workshop on resilience, people wouldn't necessarily be interested in coming to that. They better if they work through their trusted community organisations, so faith groups, parish councils, even gardening groups, allotment groups, people that were actually coming together already. They were much more open to discussion and and really widening their activities. And discussions about climate change and behaviour have got to be rooted in real life experience, which is why people like Mary, Paul, talking about these real life experiences, talking about, again, bringing it back to the individual, the people, how it impacts on people, and that really brings it to life and makes people engaged and interested. Again, you've got to start with people's existing activities. One of the things that all the groups have told us, that something that brings everybody together is food and cooking. And if you have an event that involves cooking, food, sharing food, that'll bring people in. Sustaining volunteering involvement is a challenge, even with money available, and it all takes longer than you think. So thank you very much. That is the website. Obviously, the Centre for Resilience, and you'll find our two documents on there, but I do have some printouts if you want this one. Thank you.